I overheard my friends mocking him when I came back home. There were divorce papers. I lost him. I lost the man I love. Now I'm stuck with regrets and perhaps the hope that he'll come back to me. That's why I'm here. I'm sharing my story on this app in the hope that someone out there might have advice that would help me get my man back. My name is Martha, but for privacy's sake, I'm using a made-up name. I'm 28 years old and I'm married, but I'm still clinging to hope that I can make it work. I haven't signed the papers yet, so our marriage is almost 4 years old and we don't have kids yet. I could get pregnant, but I chose not to because I was a career woman. I do regret that decision a lot. Before I met Ricky, my parents were very rich. They owned multinational companies and dealt with various businesses. They weren't involved in just one line of business, so the money came from different sources. My father was a very smart man. My mother would tell me stories about him that would keep me up at night. He used to wake me up at night to study so I could take over his company one day. He was very talented and could turn his hand to anything. He was originally from a poor background, and despite being so clever, he had to leave school early because his poor mother couldn't afford it. His father was a drunk who couldn't hold down a job and embarrassed the family. My father started working for a rich old man as his gardener and houseboy at the age of 15. He would gather all the business newspapers the rich man threw away after reading and read them. He always said he learned business from the news, and that's why he was always reading it. That's why he was so knowledgeable about business. When the rich old man died, he left one of his lands to my father because he thought he was a promising young man. My father started as a farmer and then grew his farm so big that he began to expand and invest in other businesses. That's how he became wealthy. Sadly, he died from lung cancer when he was just 48, and when I was just 10 years old. I don't want to bore you with stories of how my dad made a lot of money, but I wanted you to understand my motivation. I wanted to build on what he had already achieved and create something even bigger. I was so focused that I couldn't let anything distract me, so I didn't have time for friends, playmates, or boyfriends. During my school days, even as a child after my father died, I was only interested in my books. My mother tried to get me to have fun by throwing birthday parties for me and inviting every kid around my age to them. But I wasn't interested. I would sneak away when she wasn't looking. I would go upstairs and continue with my books. She would even organize sleepovers for me sometimes and ask me to invite some of my friends over. But I wouldn't. I couldn't because the first sleepover my mom forced me to have was a disaster. They wanted to talk about boys, fashion, the teachers they hated from school, and everything else. I wanted to talk about business. They didn't understand that. So after that, they chose to avoid me like the plague. So I basically grew up with my head stuck in one book or another. So literally socialization was one thing I lacked the most by the time I'd finished my university education and was ready to take on the world of business. I became the CEO of my father's company and was doing well with it. I traveled a lot to oversee the other companies around and was usually so busy I barely had time for anything else. I didn't go to parties except the ones that brought me potential clients or investors. I didn't have time for friends or hangouts because I was so tired. When I had the chance, I just slept. I was driven like my father was, and hence I was very successful. I started buying out companies and merging them with mine. Sometimes companies go bankrupt or are in dire need of money to support their originally thriving business. In these cases, I loan them enough money to get rid of their problems, and in exchange, I become a major shareholder and eventually buy them out. That was how I met Ricky, my husband. He was a technician in one of the companies I bought out. They gave me a lot of issues before the owner eventually decided to take the money and sell. When I found out that Ricky was the one who was against the owner selling out, I was interested because he held out long enough. The owner, when he eventually sold to me, did so under Hausnbis. I was really happy to keep the workers on, so I asked Ricky to come to my office. I'd found out he'd suggested that idea to the owner. When he came over and started talking about all his ideas for the company, I was really pleased. I employed him to work directly in the headquarters instead of the sub companies. He had this great aura about him that made me laugh. He was a very funny person to be around. I still don't know of any other person who has made me laugh as much as Ricky did. Since Ricky reported directly to me, it was easy for me to see him and hear him. I did take advantage of that opportunity. I would invite him to my office, saying I wanted to find out how his projects were going. I loved seeing the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke about his projects, or the way his dimple deepened and he smacked his fingers. Whenever he got a new idea, I knew I was attracted to him. I didn't understand why Ricky wasn't exactly handsome at first glance. He was fine, quite all right, but he wasn't exactly top 5 handsome, and it baffled me. I had always thought I would be attracted to any guy by his physique, and also fashion sense, but Ricky wasn't exactly one of those. In fact, Ricky could wear 2 different colors of clothes and end up looking like someone who just took what he saw first and wore it. He'd been speaking about his project as usual. I was only half listening. I said out loud that his fashion sense wasn't working. I felt embarrassed and wanted to apologize, but I couldn't because I was the boss and he was my employee. I felt I could say whatever I wanted. Ricky obviously took it the wrong way. The next week, he had a new look. He looked smart and clean with a new haircut, different from his usual styles. I was pleased. I was falling very much in love with him. My feelings scared me because I never had a boyfriend, so I didn't know how to act or talk around him. Love has a way of speaking for itself, especially when Ricky eventually noticed. Maybe I had made it obvious by snapping at Rachel, my personal assistant, who was flirting with Ricky right in front of me. Or the one time I had seen Ricky talking to a female employee and laughing with her like he had. I was really annoyed with him after that, and I even got his personal assistant fired. I started to get really cross with Ricky, and he eventually confronted me about it. I asked him out on a date, which I ended up ruining by not showing up. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was excited when he agreed to a date. Then I realized I had nothing casual to wear. Most of my clothes were formal, and I couldn't dress formally for a date. According to the dating advice site I saw online, I went shopping. With the help of the shop assistant, I was able to choose a casual dress. I felt excited again, but then I panicked. I didn't know what they did on dates. I had read a lot of online articles on what to do on a date, but I just knew instinctively that I couldn't do all that with Ricky and earn brownie points. The shop assistant helped me choose a casual dress, and I felt excited again, but then I panicked. I didn't know what to do on a date. I had read a lot of online articles on what to do on a date, but I just knew instinctively that I couldn't do all that with Ricky and earn brownie points. I was really disappointed and ended up not going at all, rather than going and embarrassing myself. Ricky was very upset with me, and for the next couple of days after the date, whenever he came to report, he was brief and left as quickly as he could. I knew I had to swallow my pride and apologize. I did, and I told him I had to work. I wasn't able to get away from it. Ricky was understanding and let it go. This time, he planned the next date. I showed up and had a great time. From then on, we went on many other dates. I was surprised at how many good restaurants were around that weren't 5 stars. I loved hanging out with Ricky. He was just the sweetest and most caring person. I was amazed that despite him having so little compared to my own wealthy status, he still bought me little gifts and paid for every one of our dates. I offered to pay or take our outings to more luxurious places, but he refused and told me there was more fun to be had in places you didn't have to spend much. It was nice having someone take responsibility and give me the chance to do something for myself, instead of relying on me for something I was happy with. He eventually asked me out, and I said yes without hesitation. We dated for a year, and I was happy because Ricky was my first boyfriend, first kiss, and also first sexually. He made every experience worth the wait and certainly memorable. I loved being with him so much, and he obviously adored me too. On our 1-year anniversary, Ricky had taken me to a top restaurant for the first time after we started dating. I was surprised because he never was one to go for fancy stuff like that. He was actually quite nervous. On our 1 year anniversary, Ricky took me to a top-star restaurant for the first time after we started dating. I was surprised because he never went for that kind of thing. He was wearing a suit for our dinner and looked pretty nervous. I had been wondering what was going on, but that turned into a surprise when the first arrived. The waiter brought us a ring on a plate with a "Will you marry me" design on it. I was really happy and said yes. The ring wasn't what I would have picked for myself, even as a third choice, but I was just happy Ricky loved me enough to marry me. So the ring didn't even matter at that point. The problem started when I introduced my fiancé to my mom's sisters and their kids, who lived with my mom after my dad died. I usually refused to go home because of them. They were always finding fault with me, despite the fact that they were living on my money once a week. They usually had this family gathering thing that they did. My mom was obviously bored with life and started partying and always trying to keep busy. I guess that was her way of dealing with the grief of losing Dad. So I brought Ricky to one of those gatherings to finally introduce him to the family. Well, let's just say things didn't go as planned. As it turned out, my mom was surprised that I wasn't too tied up at work to date someone. She was pretty shocked when she asked him about work, and he told her he worked with me, as did my mom's sisters and their kids. I left the party feeling pretty hurt and angry on Ricky's behalf. Ricky was the one who calmed me down and told me it was nothing, as he had by. I was prepared for such reactions. We started planning our wedding, but my mom refused to have anything to do with it. She even started disturbing me to break things off with Ricky. I threatened to leave her out of my life forever if she didn't accept my choice. My lawyers were another problem. They didn't believe that Ricky was marrying me for all the right reasons. My mom forced a prenuptial agreement on us, even though I was marrying Ricky for all the right reasons. Ricky did sign it to prove he wasn't marrying me because of my money. He agreed with everything they did except one thing, which was hosting a big wedding for us. He wanted to spend all the money and only allowed me to get my wedding dress myself, because, as he said, it was my death. The wedding was small, with only our families in attendance. My family included my mom and her siblings and their kids. Ricky's family was made up of his mother, his 2 brothers, and their last-born sister. Ricky's mom, Morgan, was incredible. I loved the tight-knit family she created with her husband, who had passed away before she even gave birth to her last child. They were always looking out for each other. She was a wonderful, loving mother who created a close-knit family with her husband, who passed away before she even gave birth to her last child. They were always open with each other and looked out for one another. I admired their relationship so much that I decided to get married. I was happier than I'd ever imagined I could be. Ricky was always the same, bless him. Despite the family troubles, he was always sweet to me. They tried to hurt him with their words, but he never complained. He just worked hard and made sure I was happy. 6 months after our wedding, Ricky, he told me about his decision to start up his own company and resign from mine. There was no choice in the matter, as he refused any sort of payment or me giving him some money for capital. 2 years into our marriage, Ricky's startup company wasn't where it should be. He had ideas and the zeal to work, but investors weren't forthcoming, and he wouldn't accept my help with the management. I invested in his company, even though he said he'd handle it on his own. I understood that he wanted to prove to everyone, especially me, that he could do well without his wife's money. I was proud of him, but I was still concerned. My mother thought it was my money he used to start his company. She also made a point of taunting him at every opportunity, whenever he failed to secure an investor or a contract. This was another chance for her to talk down to him. The problem was I never defended him. I just let her get away with it. When we got back to our own side of the house, I would just sweep the matter under the rug. I would just mutter, "You know how she is. You'll get used to it." Ricky never complained to me, though, and would just smile and move on. One time, Ricky suggested we move out of the house to our own place, and I came up with different excuses about how the house was closer to work, and I needed to be there for Mom since she had no other child, and so on. Ricky accepted my excuses. I made excuses, and didn't bring it up again. In reality, I just didn't want to leave my comfortable space. I knew that if we moved, Ricky wouldn't want me paying for a house similar to mine, but probably a smaller and less comfortable house. I didn't want that for myself. The second part of the problem started when I decided to invite Ricky's family over. I'd put together a dinner party to celebrate Ricky's birthday. It was going well. There was dancing, which I enjoyed, because Ricky was a great dancer and was always teaching me some steps. I was happy the night was going well. The food and drinks were all available. While dancing with Ricky, I noticed that my mother was sitting with my sister-in-law, and her hand was white and tight around the glass of champagne she held. I turned back to the dance floor and saw that my mother was saying something to Mara, who was replying. My mother's shocked look made it obvious that Mara had said something rude. I excused myself from the dance floor and walked up to them to find out what the argument was about. I remember hearing the last part of my mother's words, and it really hurt me. She had said her brother was nothing like. I remember my mother saying that she and my sister-in-law thought I was a bit of a social freak. Those words stuck with me even after she apologized for saying them. She said she hadn't meant to, but she'd been pushed to defend her brother against my mother's harsh words. I felt like I'd let her down. I wanted to prove to everyone that I could socialize and be a fun girl. I wanted to do something crazy, have friends, and not only talk business all the time. So I did. I started partying with friends, Anna and Marie, and some other girls. I met people who were also wealthy, like I was back then. I thought they understood me because they had responsibilities like I did, but they deflected their responsibilities to other people to handle. They only did so little as sit through important meetings and sign documents and checkbooks, so they had enough time on their hands to have fun. I did the same too. I only went to the office if I couldn't get out of a meeting or to go sign documents. I was the little girl who wanted to be just like her father. My marriage was also affected by my desire to be different. I was spending less and less time with my husband at first. He assumed it was work keeping me busy until he heard me booking a spa day for my friends. He was surprised and asked about my friends, but I didn't want to tell him, so I ignored him that morning. Looking back, I realized I was also insecure and jealous and didn't want to introduce Ricky to my friends in case they noticed what I did and fell in love with him. My wealth started getting to my head. I let it go, thinking I could spend my money however I liked. When Ricky asked me about the sudden change, I told him I wanted to start living a little. There was so much out there to be seen. The crazy thing is, whenever I had a party, I never went with Ricky. Not just the fun parties that my friends had, but also any business party. Back then, I didn't want anyone asking him what he did and realizing he earned less than I did. In fact, most people I worked with felt the same way. As clients or investors didn't even know I was married, the final and most major part of the problem started when my mom pushed me to go out with Brandon. Brandon was one of her friend's sons, and my mom thought him a better choice for me than Ricky, so she made a good effort to bring him to my work that day. Meanwhile, Ricky had decided to surprise me with lunch because he knew how busy I could get and forget to eat. I was still savoring the meal he whipped up for me when my mom entered with this guy, whom I originally didn't know existed. When she saw Ricky, she was clearly annoyed. Of course, she tried to hide it, but I could read her like a book. She used to wear loads of makeup and act like she was totally fine, but I could see what she was really feeling. This started after my dad died, so she introduced Brandon to me. When I shook his hand and said hello, he didn't let go straight away and just kissed my hand right in front of Ricky. Ricky was pretty shocked. I quickly removed my hand from his palm when Brandon looked at me for an introduction of Ricky. My mom beat me to it, though, and said he was just an ahling, and boy, probably there to give me food. I was shocked, though, to be honest. I didn't know what to say when Brandon asked for an introduction of Ricky because I was embarrassed, but I didn't intend to call him an errand boy. I just stood there, looking between my mother, and then Brandon and Ricky didn't say anything, just packed up the remaining dish he'd brought me and left. My mom was visibly satisfied when he left, and I glared at her, angry at her for embarrassing him like that, and at myself for not defending my husband. Brandon started visiting me regularly. He would show up at work, in social gatherings that I went to, literally everywhere I knew. It was my mom's handiwork, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I liked him being around. Brandon was definitely a playboy. He was very smooth with words and got a lot of attention wherever he went, which was easy given how handsome he looked. What made me really happy was that whenever he did turn up at places I was at, he focused on me so much that it seemed like everyone else didn't exist. Brandon was my ideal type. If I was asked what my ideal type was, he would definitely be on the list. He wasn't as rich as I was, but he would probably be top 4 richest. He was good looking, a smooth talker, and knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't shy to go for it. At first, whenever he invited me to dinner dates or lunch, I turned him down. I wanted to respect what I had with Ricky. I still loved Ricky very much, but at that point it felt like there were 2 different people inside of me. One was still in love with Ricky and didn't want to betray him. The other wanted to explore the chemistry she had with Brandon. I started going on dates with Brandon, and he really made an effort to make them special. Sometimes he'd take me on trips to another country or state for dinner or a tour of a museum. I'd never been interested in art before, but seeing how much Brandon loved it and how he'd talk about the history of each piece we saw made me start studying it too. He was just so tempting, and I guess I wasn't trying too hard to resist. One time Brandon invited me to a party. It was his friend's 5th wedding anniversary, and it was a +1 party, so he'd asked me to go with him. I'd said no at first because Ricky'd asked me if I was free that night for a date, because it'd been so long since we'd done that. I was torn. I could either hurt Brandon's feelings by going on a less fancy date with my husband or go to the party as Brandon's date and hurt my husband's feelings. I didn't want to hurt either of them, but I ended up hurting my husband. I'd ordered a dress online, and it was delivered to me at the office. It was absolutely stunning. I'd also ordered a matching bag and heels, so I just styled my hair in my bathroom and applied lip gloss. I don't usually wear makeup, so that was about as much as I could do. I hadn't worn any makeup on my wedding day with Ricky, so I went with Brandon to Wayshore. Everyone was talking about my dress and how I looked. Brandon's friends were surprised he'd brought someone, because he never did in the past. It made me feel special that he liked me enough to invite me to his friend's party. When we started dancing to the slow rhythm of the song, Brandon looked at me without blinking and lowered his head for a kiss. I met him halfway. It was our first kiss, and it was amazing. Brandon's kisses were nothing like Ricky's. Ricky's kisses felt like home, safe, sweet, warm, and comforting. Brandon's kisses were like a kid playing with a bomb, dangerous and flirtatious. After the party, I insisted that he drop me off I didn't want to face Ricky. I was all over the place, feelings-wise. But one thing I recognized amidst them was guilt. I was cheating on my husband, and I didn't like that one bit. But my feelings for Brandon were growing by the minute. I couldn't help myself when I got home the next morning. Ricky didn't say anything to me. He just left the house and went to work. I was trying to walk by our mini table in the room when I noticed a ticket. It seemed like Ricky had booked a ticket to go to Paris for one evening and come back the next morning. I felt more guilty because I knew how much he must have spent. I felt really bad because I knew Ricky had probably chosen Paris because I'd always talked about wanting to go there with someone I loved. I felt like I'd wasted it. The evenings are the most beautiful times in the city. I'd spent the evening living like Paris in another man's arms. I knew I had to end things with Brandon. I didn't want to hurt Ricky more than I already had, so I called him and asked to meet, but he said he was caught up with meetings and that we could only meet in the afternoon. I waited for him to call me in the afternoon, but he didn't. That evening, he sent me a text to apologize for missing the lunch we'd arranged and asked if I'd like to come over to his hotel for dinner. I shouldn't have gone, but I knew that I would probably lose my nerve to tell him I wanted to end things between us. I didn't go through with it that day, so I went to his hotel and was directed to his VIP suite when I went in with the MasterCard that Brandon had instructed the receptionist to give me. Brandon was in the bathroom, and when I called him, he asked for a minute. By the time he came out, he only wrapped a towel around his waist. I could see the line of his hair disappearing into the towel. I averted my eyes and reminded myself that I came for a reason. Brandon asked me to sit while he got changed and ordered us dinner, but I refused and told him I had to tell him something urgently. He sat on the edge of his queen. I was sitting on a king-size bed, and I told him the truth about my mom trying to force us to be together when I was actually married. I didn't want to live a lie anymore, even though I was still married. Brandon was shocked, and he just sat there staring at me for a few minutes before he stood up and walked toward me. He took my hand in his, and he told me that he knew I was married because my mom eventually told him. I was unhappy in the marriage, though I was too in love with my husband to end it. I wanted to correct him because I was very happy with Ricky. Brandon stopped me and said he didn't mind that I was married. He kissed me, and we ended up having sex that evening. I know I'm a terrible person, but in that position, what would you have done? I probably would have run to the other side of the room and left. Well, I didn't do that. I really regret it now. From then on, I started having less and less time for Ricky. I was barely home because if I wasn't in Brandon's bed, I was with my friends at one party or another. They knew about my affair with Brandon and were really excited for me. They were super supportive, even though Ricky was a great guy. Even if Brandon worked hard for years, they spent time usually mocking Ricky and praising Brandon. Sometimes I would even join in, telling them how ridiculous our dates were. One example is the day everything came crashing down. I went to a party organized by Marie. It started as a normal day. I had left Brandon's place that morning, gone to work, then later that evening headed to Marie's place for the party. We had been drinking, but not too drunk. I had shown the girls the necklace Brandon had gifted me. The night before, they were excited for me. They started teasing Ricky, saying he couldn't afford it and wasn't up to Brandon. They said I was lucky to have met Brandon. I laughed and agreed. After the party, I checked my phone. I saw a message from Ricky. It said, "We need to talk." I was surprised because I knew Ricky never sent such a direct message. Before, he'd always ended with an "I love you" and lots of love emojis, which I'd found cute. That evening, I texted him that I had to go home, and he sent me a sad emoji. I went home, and when I got to our room, Ricky was sitting in the dark and holding a paper. To cut a long story short, apparently Ricky had shown up at the party as I hadn't come home in the last few. It took weeks, but he overheard me mocking him with my friends. When I got back home, there were divorce papers waiting for me to sign. How he got the divorce papers ready within 3 hours still baffles me. Perhaps he had been contemplating it a lot. Maybe it was enduring my mother's abuses or my family's mocking that had tipped him to the edge. Or maybe it was me never standing up for him. Or maybe it was me ignoring and taking him for granted. But I guess the last straw was when he heard my friend comparing him to my lover and me, laughing and joking with them at that moment. Everything happened so fast. I was begging Ricky to forgive me, but he wouldn't listen. He just packed his bags and left the house that night. I cried like I have never before in my life, and I wanted to get some sort of comfort. That night, around midnight, I went to Brandon's hotel room, and since I had a key with me, I didn't bother knocking. I just opened the door and went in. I was pretty shocked to see Marie and Brandon lying naked in the same bed and sleeping soundly. They didn't even wake up when I knocked over the lamp in the room. My legs were too shaky to hold me still, so I guessed from the champagne bottle lying carelessly on the floor that they were both very busy. I left and went back to my now empty house, which only had my clothes and a few of Ricky's. It's been a few days now, and Ricky's brother, who is a lawyer, was probably Deborah. The lawyer who prepared the divorce papers was calling to remind me to sign them. I didn't know his brother was a lawyer because I hadn't been interested in my husband. I regret everything now. I really love Ricky, and the thought of losing him is horrifying. Please, I need help getting my husband back. Hello, Reddit. I came on this app to tell my story. in hopes that perhaps I'll get some advice. I'm trying to win back Ricky, but so far all I've got are hateful comments. They've made me feel even worse than I already do. I realized I lost Ricky because I wasn't a good wife to him. I didn't defend him or stand up for him. Instead, I just let him face all the problems alone because he was always smiling. I didn't realize I was digging a bigger hole in his heart by pretending not to notice everything he was going through. All because he loved me. I even cheated on him with a mountain. I've realized that I didn't exactly start cheating on him when I met Brand, but long before that. I started cheating on him when I allowed my mother to have her way and also insult him every chance she got. I cheated on him when I refused to stand up for him or support his decision to leave the house. I cheated on him when he was standing right there, and my mother called him an errand boy, and I couldn't even say anything. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible wife when my mother heard about the divorce and was pleased that her plans had come to fruition. I was so angry that I laughed and lashed out at her, sending her and her sisters and their kids out of the house. I bought a small apartment that could only contain my mother and have never spoken to her since. Living alone in that big house felt like a punishment because my room was filled with everything Ricky had. The picture of him smiling adoringly was on my wall. The picture of him smiling adoringly was taken on our wedding day, and it taunted me every day because I had it and I lost it due to my foolishness. He wouldn't even take my calls. I even went to see his mother, but the once loving mother who looked at me adoringly had changed and became so cold, it was like she never knew me. It's not her fault. I mean, who would blame a mother for wanting to protect her son from a devil like me? I feel so empty, and yet the emptiness is painful. I don't know how that's possible, but the emptiness is just so much more than I can bear. Update, hello, this is probably my last post here. I just wanted to tell you all that I finally signed the divorce papers. I realized there was nothing I could do to change Ricky's mind, and that asking for his forgiveness would be a sin after everything I did to him. I'm very regretful and wish I had done things better. I hope you can learn from me. Goodbye, and thanks from a terrible wife in person.